So my name's Chris Cowan and I work at Kantar World Panel. They're a market research company and I'm going to talk to you today about why more people buy potatoes than buy toilet roll. I'm going to set the scene by talking about four main things, and the first is really, hands up if anyone saw my talk 2 years ago. I don't recognise lots of faces, but yeah, so for the people that were here, there's an update, but for lots of you, I'm going to look back at what I said 2 years ago and how things have moved on. Then I'm going to talk a bit about what shoppers are worried about, so some of what Emily and Steve touched on, some of these shopper concerns and the impacts this is having on the produce category and potatoes. And then finally, sort of what opportunity I still see for potatoes from a sort of shopper lens. So a little bit about me. So I don't know if you Google me, but if you did, you probably got that. And as my mum always points out, there's a really unflattering photo. So if you're sort of sat there, you're getting a sort of similar view. But what do I know about farming? Actually, very little. I'm a Londoner. In fact, I'm from West London, so not exactly surrounded in fields. That green is Griffin Park, so home of my beloved Brentford FC. I haven't moved very far either, so that black arrow is where my parents live. So I've moved 200 feet. So I've been told to tell people who work in the potato industry about potatoes. What I do have, though, is quite a bit of experience working across grocery markets. So I've worked across a lot of different industries during my time at Kantar, and you can see it's quite varied. And for the last 5 years, I've really focused on the fresh produce market. The main way we get our data, and this is sort of the last bit about us, and then I'll crack on with the interesting stuff. We collect data in three main ways. So in the UK, it's people bringing the shopping into their home. So they've got a little barcode scanner, they record their shopping, and the good thing with that is you see all of their shopping behaviour across the grocery market. In other countries we operate, we also do things like pen and paper. My personal favourite, though, is in some countries, we get our panellists to basically collect all of the things they buy and put them into bins. We then send field workers with their consent to go through these bins and look at what people have been buying. So we're tracking a lot of shopping behaviour. But now the interesting stuff. So what was I saying 2 years ago? One of the big themes, and we'll share these slides after, so don't worry about scribbling things down. Really, it was a time of deflation. Lower prices were coming into the market. We know potatoes were particularly affected by that. It was taking out about £250 million a year from the produce market simply by lowering prices. We were starting to see a little bit of frequency gains within the market, so people buying produce a little bit more often. It was a tough time for a lot of the retailers. Aldi and Lidl were making headways. That was when we were seeing phenomenal growth from Aldi and really strong growth from Lidl. Lots of the other established retailers were struggling. And the potato volumes were starting to pick up. So it had been quite a bleak picture in terms of volume, but it was starting to turn a corner. So what's happened since then? Well, if we think about the produce market, it splits into three quite nice sections. So we've got whole head veg, whole head fruit, and then prepared. So prepared is anything that's washed and processed. If we think about their market sizes, veg at that time, 2 years ago, was the largest sector. Actually, it was overtaken by fruit a couple of years ago, or about 18 months ago, overwhelmingly driven by the berry category. So berries has overtaken potatoes as the largest sort of super category within produce. All three, though, are in cash growth now, so that's quite a positive place to be. When we come to volume, though, what we see is veg remains the largest sector. So veg is cheaper by price per kilo, but that's where we still see it gaining. All three, again, are growing ahead of the population growth. So the key takeaway is we're buying a bit more fruit and veg per household each year. The thing that surprised me, and this hasn't quite worked with the formatting, that's the average amount that's spent by each household on each of these sections in a year. So actually, we don't really spend very much on fruit and veg as an average household. It's between sort of £4 and £5 on veg, sort of similar numbers for fruit. So actually, it's not a great amount. And then finally, how often do we engage with produce? Now, the really interesting thing is it's the highest frequency area, so most often shopped within the grocery category. It's also the only category in grocery that's bought by everyone, so lots of opportunity to sell to lots of people. What's been going on in terms of driving the market? So that was the frequency. So this blue just denotes growth in frequency. So shoppers buying a little bit more often, and we turn it to a cash amount, and we can see that's been positive. We start seeing trip size, which is the darker blue, price. So we saw periods of deflation, which was very much driven by what we saw in the potato market a few years ago, based on the shortages we saw in the market, which then led to a shortage of supply, which would then follow with a glut of lots of supply in the market. Prices come tumbling down. Now, if we look to the start of 2017 onwards, these are higher prices coming through. So some of this is inflation linked to post-Brexit, Some of it is things like the shortage of salad within Spain and sort of the Italian regions back at the start of the year. So a mixture of things, but we're continuing to see people buying produce a little bit more often. How have the retailers performed? So this is just going to plot. And if we remember when I showed what was happening 2 years ago, it was pretty bleak for all. Most retailers' growth lines are now above the zero. So actually, they've turned their performances around. So retailers that had really been struggling, there are lots of different reasons for this, but we're seeing growth picking up. If we look at the retailer shares over time, what we can see is the erosion of what we call the established retailers' shares, so steadily coming down. The real standout has to be Aldi in this time. So over 5 years, they've gone from commanding a 3.5% market share in the produce market, and this is cash terms, it's not even volume. Volume's much higher, to now 9%. So that's well ahead of their grocery market share, and actually means, so yeah, almost 1 in 10 pounds spent in produce is in an Aldi. One other thing, and I've just included this slide, really, it looks at different channels, so different ways of engaging with different retailers, so whether that be online, whether that be the discounters, and this is just the percentage of sales that are sold on a promotion within produce. The interesting thing is, overwhelmingly, everyone's been pulling back on promotions, but if you look at the line at the bottom, so that sort of bluey line, that's the discounters on deal. What we saw with the discounters, so Aldi and Lidl, ramping up their level of promotion, and now they're almost in line and sort of promoting as much as you'd expect from one of the established retailers. But also in the last 18 months, something quite significant's happened which will affect how much retailers promote, and that's been the introduction of farm stores. And I'm not here to debate about this. I'm simply going to talk about what impact it's had on the market. So we've got total produce sales there in grey, which I appreciate from a distance doesn't stand out very well, but like I said, you'll get the slides after. The key thing is that red line, and that's the total sales coming from this economy tier as we'd define it. It's still very small. In fact, if we look as a proportion of sales, so now it's just the percentage of total produce at this economy level, we can see we're not too far off now in 2017 where we were 5 years ago. The real change was between sort of 2013 to 2015, we were really pulling back our economy lines within produce. It's almost a bit of a cyclical effect, whereby we sort of are where we were 5 years ago. And similarly, the same picture if we look in volume. So we can see it's now almost 10% of volume within produce is through one of these economy sort of farm stores, farm brand lines. So we've been talking a bit about price and what the retailers have been doing. What are shoppers telling us that's really important to them? So we record how concerned people are about various things. When it comes explicitly to food, we sort of track the big 8 nutrients, as we'd call them, people's concerns around them. Now, the number one concern that shoppers have is on sugar. It's had a lot of press recently, and this is affecting how people are shopping in certain markets. But we get asked quite a lot, well, what impacts, say, the carb concern having on the produce market? So I thought I'd look at it. Now, we know that carbs have been getting a bash, and potatoes are sort of included within that, and carbs is a very sort of, it has mixed meanings to different people. But the concerning thing for us is 24, or just under 25% of our panellists are telling us that they're either fairly or very concerned about their carb intake. And actually, what's their intention to change? Well, almost 2/3 of them plan to reduce their carb intake in the next year. So actually, those are sort of alarm bells ringing. It's sort of thinking, well, this is bad. Those that are most concerned have already started decreasing the amount of potato volume that they buy. Now, the thing that we always say is sort of don't just listen to what people say. It's about looking at what they actually do. So I won't ask, well, unless someone wants to shout a number, what percent of people plan to cut out their carb intake entirely? Well, it's very low, so people are realistic. They're not going to cut out all carbs. So it's 1%. But if we plot people's intentions, so we've got people from cutting out completely to increasing a lot, we can see that the two largest groups are either reduce a little or reduce quite significantly. So actually, there is some concern out there in this intention to reduce. What then happens if we plot what people are saying against what they do, though? And this is where it, for me, gets quite interesting. So we're just going to look at their year-on-year potato purchasing. So they're buying more or fewer spuds. Actually, those that plan to cut out completely have increased their potato purchasing by almost 5%, whereas those that plan to increase a lot have reduced it by almost 15%. The thing that's quite interesting is then when you overlay, well, what about other carbohydrates? So we've got pasta and we've got bread. you can see that actually, so firstly this was, rice, and pasta. Firstly on rice, people's intention is much more followed by what they then do. And similarly, when we then look at pasta. So there is a case that, yes, potatoes falls under this sort of carb concern and carb issue, but I think there's some blurring of lines, and I think we'd be remiss if we just thought that people being anti-carbs meant they were anti-potato. I don't think we're seeing the evidence there because it's not as sort of an explicit a choice as people are thinking. So both Steve and Emily mentioned about this growing need of health, and actually we look at how people use their products too. So one of the things is health is the growing trend that we see within grocery, but it's changing. So what does health mean to people? It's less about telling people what's bad about food and more about sort of positive health. And we've seen that coming through both on the marketing side, but also things like food communication. But actually, within produce, health hasn't been the big driver of growth over the last 4 years. It's actually been enjoyment. So people choosing produce because they like it more. And that sort of is quite a nice sort of message to be telling an industry, because people aren't choosing it because they're sort of on the sort of a health kick or something in the short term. This is actually the enjoyment, because the great thing about when people choose food for enjoyment, they spend a bit more on it. So actually, if we look at the 4-year growth between these two need states, we see practicality is flat, and actually enjoyment's up 7.2%. Health at 3.9% is growing, and I guess one of the issues is, so what do we do about this within potatoes? If we think about, so at a total produce level, health as a concern is growing at 3.9%. It's actually been declining amongst veg consumption. So people choosing veg for health reasons has come down. So this presents us with a massive opportunity. If the retailers are getting behind a story of promoting health and the inherent health that produce has as well, there's a great opportunity here, because it's where fruit's really capitalised on getting people to choose it for health reasons. And here's just a little bit more detail. So we can see things, it's other sort of side of dish components of produce. So things like brassicas and potatoes have been suffering with not being chosen for health. But it's one thing to say, okay, people's attitudes are changing, but are we selling more stuff or selling less stuff? Along the bottom axes, I've just got the percentage change in health as the driver of consumption. And along the other axes, I can't remember which one, we've got the volume change. And what we can see, ignore the outlier of avocados, we see potatoes down here. But actually, this idea of health doesn't really pull apart lots of different produce markets. If we look at practicality, it starts pulling apart the markets. And again, appreciate you're far back there, this is small, you will get these slides after. The thing that's interesting for me is when we start looking at enjoyment, and when we can start seeing things actually being chosen for enjoyment more. Because as I said earlier, this is where shoppers do spend more, when they're enjoying an occasion. So what does this ultimately mean within potatoes? So we know it's a massive category. It's bought by 95% of us. We know it's one of the most frequently bought categories within the grocery market. We're buying it on a fortnightly basis. In fact, it's one of the largest categories in grocery. Almost a penny in every pound is spent on potatoes. On a weekly basis, 64% of us will eat a potato at home, and actually it will feature in about 2.5 dishes a week. When I mentioned earlier about volumes stabilising, we have seen some return to growth of the potato market volume. So it's lots of good things. And I mentioned earlier about the economy tier. Actually, the green represents the economy tier within potatoes. So lots is still going through that sort of branded premium tier, but lots is going through the standard. Economy still quite small. But one thing I didn't talk about, and it's sort of coming to sort of my wrap-up points, loo roll. Just a quick show of hands if you've either bought or had a retail potato product brought back into your home in the last year. I'd imagine it's quite a high percentage of you. Now, drop your hand if you haven't bought toilet paper. Well, actually, the really interesting thing for me is more people do buy potatoes. So actually, it's about 1 in 11 people, so a fair number of you might be lying, that actually don't buy toilet paper in a year. Now, what this means is, look, it's really hard to grow potatoes by selling to more shoppers. We've got almost everyone we can get. It's hard to get sort of frequency up amongst everyone. Actually, it's about some targeted approaches. So What I've got here, and again, I appreciate this is going to be a nightmare to see at the back, this is just how often people buy potatoes. It's a stacked bar. You can see, right, we've got some people that bloody love potatoes, buy them all the time. We've got some people that don't buy them very often. Those people that buy them at least once a month, but not quite, buy them at least once a quarter, but not quite once a month, fall into that bracket. Who are those shoppers that have some engagement with potatoes, but they're not buying it that regularly? It tends to be the smaller and younger households. So very much what Emily and Steve were pointing at tends to be people who are based in the south, who are higher earners. They'll be shopping more in convenience channels. This is your target audience. That's what they read. They don't read the Daily Express, Telegraph, or Mail. You can sort of build an idea. Basically, it's a Ponzi version of me. How could this look? I'm not a merchandiser either, but I do like shopping in Ponzi shops, and I was in Whole Foods, and a shameless plug, I was on holiday in America. That's how they sell their potatoes. It looks appealing. It's in a city centre, and it works because there are people sort of stood there at fixture, picking up the potato bags, looking at them. Is it realistic? This is my final point, and then you're free. Pink Lady is an example of a brand who actually, within produce, have affected people's shopping behaviours, and they've done it through a targeted approach. So a few years ago at the BP 2015, I spoke about falling volumes in the apple category. If we look at what had happened, actually, yeah, there'd been some better supply and some heavier promotions in the market. Volumes turned around, and we saw a bit of an uplift. What that doesn't explain, though, is how Pink Lady go to be the third largest variety/brand in the market. What they did was really clever. They found a target of audience, which was young women. They had a very clear message, which was around calorie deficits. In fact, they went pretty explicit on taking on the competition, taking on specific muesli bars. What happened? Well, the thing that drove their cash performance, so actual sales, young couples. The thing that drove their consumption, it was all about young females. What did they then do next? So for those that have seen that Pink Lady example before, I've got something new. They targeted kids with snacking. Lots of, again, marketing and focused, targeted, sort of clear message, who they're going after and what occasion. Back when they started the campaign, 39% of apples that kids ate was snacked on. They've actually managed to get that up to 41%. It doesn't sound massive, but this is changing the snacking behaviour of children, which actually is quite an achievement in itself. So for me, at a time where, look, we've got a massive category that's bought by lots of people, we're not going to get more people buying potatoes, that's really difficult. Can we play around with some targeted engagement? Because otherwise there's this big pressure on us to push a more sort of value price message. Actually, yeah, because people are enjoying their produce more, and there's the health element to it as well. So for me, look, if it can happen in produce, because it does happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for joining us for the seminar on consumer behaviour. So myself and Emily work for AHDB's Consumer Insight team. We essentially track, monitor and evaluate consumer behaviour across all AHDB sector products. And we look at trying to build an understanding about how consumers shop and how they behave and the impact that can have on our categories. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to take you through essentially some of the key things that we see around consumer behaviour in the consumer landscape. It's going to cover about what consumers are looking for. We're also going to pick out a bit of behaviour changes on age and life stage, but also how we could generate a healthy interest in potatoes. So what do consumers want? We collect our information through various different schemes, and one of the mechanisms is a continuous consumer tracker through IGD. And that tells us some of the top priorities that people pick out when shopping. The number one item that comes up top of the list is quality. Now that quality can mean anything to consumers, and that can be around the appearance of fixture, the benefits those products add, but also the value for money they feel they're achieving. The second thing that features very heavily, and this is across all grocery products, I should say, is price and promotions. There's no getting away from that they have a big impact in what people choose to buy. Often, price and promotion is a big step in behavioural changes, and consumers have actually adapted their shopping behaviour over the last 5 to 10 years through food inflation changes. And we've seen growth in some of the hard discounters such as Aldi and Lidl, but we've also seen changes in what products they choose. And thirdly, the other aspect to consider carefully is pack size. So consumers are essentially there's a growing number of 1- and 2-person households there, and they're essentially looking to customise the size of products they buy. So for potatoes, it has a big impact of whether or not consumers would actually pick up a large bag of spuds at their supermarket checkout, or whether they're looking to customise it via sort of smaller packs, but also loose options, so they can actually take home what they require to limit the amount of wastage. So what consumers want for when they're cooking in the home? Well, the kind of key thing that we're picking up from our consumer data is a meal variety. There's a growing number of people that are looking for meal inspiration. They're looking in particular about sort of what dishes fit with their lifestyles and behaviours. There's also other factors that kind of play a part, and we've picked out health and enjoyment. Health is a growing trend for consumers at a total food level, and we're also seeing an increase area of focus for all product categories in this area. But it's also really important to remember enjoyment. So consumers pick food because they enjoy it, and the dishes they eat are often because the family enjoy those products. So it's thinking about how potatoes fit in with those kind of meal choices that will become key to future growth. And lastly, it's kind of built on convenience. So life stage and hectic lifestyles also mean that people are being pressurised in what they're cooking in the home, and it's actually what food products meet their sort of cooking needs for that night that make it into the shopping basket. So what do consumers think about potatoes? Well, our consumer tracker that we do on a quarterly basis picks out some of the consumer trends. For potatoes, there's some really big strengths. So 90% of consumers that we surveyed said that they see potatoes as a great way, or there's lots of ways to serve, which offers great versatility message that we can use in our communications to consumers. We've also got some really key strengths in terms of from a refrigerated, chilled and frozen aspect of the potato sort of offering to consumers. They sort of tell us that they see those areas as really quick and easy to use and prepare. And we think going forward, this is an area of significant growth opportunity for potatoes. But with any positives, there do become challenges. Consumers do pick out for us that fresh potatoes can be heavy to carry home, which kind of links back to that earlier message about adapting pack size for their suitability. But also the other message that comes through to us is that it takes too long to prepare. So in that, how we build on those kind of challenges is where we might actually open up growth opportunities for consumers. So how could potatoes meet that consumer needs? Well, some of it is around meeting that key preparation time. We've seen that the average preparation time in 1980 was an hour. The average prep time to prepare and cook a main meal in 2016 was half an hour. So it's thinking about how products and meals fit within that half an hour window that will gain traction with consumers. And that also links to convenience shopping. Now, convenience can mean about the convenience of having it on the shelf and the availability in store, but it's also about the convenience that people know, that meal inspiration about what they'll do with that product once it gets in the home. And offering those key meal varieties. And we have seen a strong competition from potatoes from other carbohydrates, such as rice and pasta in the long term. So we see some key opportunities for potatoes. Pre-prepared potatoes, so ready-peeled, ready-made mash type aspects, things that take steps out for the consumer from the raw ingredient could add value. And there are indications that we see that consumers are actually willing or prepared to pay more for those types of products. So it not only offers great convenience, but also adds value into the supply chain. The other one is thinking about smaller pack sizes. Now, it's not to say there isn't the market for large pack sizes there, but it's also offering consumers the opportunity to adapt and evolve to make sure it's customised for their needs. And lastly, that all kind of fits into easy meal ideas, making it quick and easy for people to go from the supermarket, pick up items, and actually make that logical step with what meals would they choose in the home. So that was a little bit of a whistle stop about consumer landscape in the home, and I'm just going to hand over now to Emily, who's going to take you through some key age and lifestyle behaviour changes we see.
Thanks, Steve. So, there are many different ways that we can segment consumers to look at their attitudes and behaviours, and one of these is to group people by age. Recently, we've been doing some research to look into the attitudes of young consumers specifically to see whether they differ in any ways from older generations. I'm going to take you through a few key findings of this now. So, why would we think about age? Well, We know that consumers tend to retain the habits that they build up early on in life as they get older. So we think that it's important that we understand what these habits are, but that we also understand what the behaviours that influence these habits are, because the young consumers of today will be the older consumers in a few years' time. So, thinking specifically about young consumers, there's been a lot of different terminology used in the media to describe different age groups of people, and a few examples of these are on the slides. But when we're thinking about young consumers, generally, in terms of food, we're thinking about people who are currently between the ages of 18 and 34 years old. Now, our findings have found that whilst this group of people do tend to have lower confidence in their cooking ability, they're also really keen to try new flavours and new cuisine types, so they still definitely have an appetite for food. But perhaps more importantly, we've decided that maybe it's not their numerical age that dictates the food choices they make so much as the stage that they're at in their life. So to try and explain what I mean by this, we've put together this diagram which illustrates a few possible life stages that a person might experience between the ages of 18 and 34. So it might involve going through things from being a student, perhaps living away from home for the first time, right through to maybe settling down and owning their own home, or even starting their own family. And this is quite a broad spectrum of life stages within that age range. And these all have very significant impacts on the food choices that we might be able to make, in terms of things such as your budget that's available to purchase food, the number of people that you're feeding on a daily basis, and perhaps even the storage that you have available to store food in. So we can think about this perhaps more broadly across all life stages, because as we age, well, our living situation is going to change a lot, but some of the key challenges that we face in relation to food will be reoccurring. To exemplify this, we've put up a few different life stages and some of the challenges they might face. So first of all, one which I know something about, being a student. So whilst I was a student, I lived in a house with 5 other people. We all shared a kitchen, but we all cooked individually. So shopping for just myself and eating alone does limit what you might be buying on a weekly basis. Also, having only one shelf in the fridge, one drawer in the freezer, and one cupboard to store all of my food in limited how much I might be willing to buy and the types of products that I'd have space to store. Secondly, a young family. Their needs might be different in that they might be catering for different food choices, so perhaps they're cooking a different meal for the parents than they are for their children. They're again going to be limited by time, everyone being on different schedules, working family, busy home life. And again, they're going to have the limitations of their budget. And finally, an elderly or a retired person, again, constrained by their budget, but also going to be catering for that small meal type, perhaps if they're only living alone or just with a partner. And furthermore, their access to the shops may be restricted if they don't have the same transport opportunities as other ages. So the purpose of this slide is to try and show that although they might arise for different reasons, some consumer needs will reoccur many times and be the same for consumers. So by targeting products at solving a consumer need or easing a consumer need rather than targeting people by age, you might be appealing to more people. Secondly, I'd like to talk to you now about health. So we know that at a total grocery level, the number of meal occasions which have been chosen for health reasons has been steadily increasing over the past few years. And whilst Steve has already mentioned that health is not the only thing that comes into our food choices, there's also the aspect of convenience, practicality, and enjoyment, because we eat food because we want to. For the next few slides, we're just going to think about health. So, there are many ways that food choices might help a consumer to satisfy their desire to live healthily. This might be choosing to prepare more meals from scratch. It might be moderating what they are eating, or perhaps supplementing their diet with extra vitamins or minerals. And because consumers are already interested in this healthiness and have a desire to be more healthy, this is perhaps an opportunity, particularly for fresh and chilled categories, to reinforce messages about good nutrition. From our consumer tracker, we know that fresh potatoes are already generally considered to be quite healthy by general consumers. And furthermore, specific preparation methods such as baking and boiling are also associated with this. So we're coming from quite a strong base. Furthermore, I'm sure that everyone in this room is already aware that potatoes have various nutritional benefits, but perhaps the average consumer of the spuds that you grow and prepare is not. Perhaps they've forgotten or do not consider potatoes to be as healthy as other items, and this is an area where messages can be reinforced. As with everything, we've already mentioned there is competition in the carbohydrate market. And with the increasing interest in varied cuisine types and different meal choices available for consumers at dinner, how is it that potatoes can be the carbohydrate of choice when so many dishes perhaps don't feature potatoes as the key carbohydrate component? Consumers are looking for that meal inspiration. There's a further challenge in that when asked about pasta, rice and potatoes, rice is generally perceived to be more healthy by consumers than potatoes. But this just reinforces the need to continue to promote those health and nutritional messages which are positive for potatoes. And now I'd like to pass back to Steve.
Thanks, Emily. So just to wrap up there, essentially there's lots of elements there that we have kind of covered at a top line level. And essentially what we need to remember is some of the key aspects for potatoes. There's some really great strengths out there, but it's thinking about how they home into consumer trends. The first kind of checklist in terms of a pointer for the potato industry would be thinking about what your fusion is with consumer trends. So how do you build and satisfy the kind of consumer need for ease and speed? The other second point is clearly communicate the benefits of the product. So don't feel that everyone knows about the strengths of your product. Shout hard and be proud about the health credentials of the product, but also about the benefits that that food item can bring to consumers. And lastly, it's all about just trying to fit in then with other dynamics that consumers are building into their food choices, be it life stage, convenience and health. And it's almost a synergy of these kind of things that will add long-term growth to the potato category. So hopefully what we've covered this morning has given you a good idea about what AHDB's Consumer Insight team can do. A little bit of a shameless plug here for our newsletter that you can sign up via our website. And we've also got copies of our Younger Consumers and Health reports, which are just at the back of the seminar here. But then after this seminar session, we'll put on the AHDB stand for anyone if they would like a copy in more depth. But thank you very much for listening.